And Dr. Beisner brought us up to speed on the impact of the EPA regulations. Now, the interview that you all have been waiting for since I announced it on the Facebook page and looking forward to it, and we spoke of it even last week during our interview with this man, the same man, that's right. He is the president of the Valhalla Project. He is the author of Separated at Birth, How North Korea Became the Evil Twin, Inside Gitmo, Dispelling the Myths of Guantanamo Bay, and Warrior Police, which he wrote with his wife, Rolling with America's Military Police in the World's Troubled Spots. Lieutenant Colonel Gordon Cucullu, Green Beret, served in Vietnam and has been serving those who served us post 9/11 vets, or post 9/11 vets at the Valhalla Project. Colonel, thanks for making time for us tonight.
Oh, it's always a pleasure, Crane. Great to be on with this audience.
Absolutely. Let's begin with what has been said about the Bergdahl release. Here's a montage of some of the key messages that the mainstream media actually started to repeat. Roll it.
The United States has always had a pretty sacred rule.
President Obama on a global stage this morning defending a sacred mission to return U.S. prisoners of war.
We don't leave people behind. It's a sacred duty to bring them back, etc.
And there's a sacred bond with our men and women in uniform.
That is a sacred obligation.
The president pushed back by saying he has a sacred trust. I think he actually said it very well, what I just heard, which is a sacred principle.
We still have a sacred obligation to bring that person back.
Sacred.
Sacred.
Sacred. Sacred.
Sacred.
Sacred. Sacred.
We have a sacred obligation that we have upheld since the founding of our republic.
Now I give you Susan Rice in describing Bo Bergdahl's service. Roll it.
Certainly, anybody who's been held in those conditions in captivity for 5 years has paid an extraordinary price. But that is really not the point. The point is that he's back. He's going to be safely reunited with his family. He served the United States with honor and distinction. And we'll have the opportunity eventually to learn what has transpired in the past years. But what's most important now is his health and well-being, that he have the opportunity to recover in peace and security and be reunited with his family, which is why this is such a joyous day.
Colonel, I recognize we obviously are happy that someone is safe who has served us in our country. A soldier is safe. And I can't imagine what has gone through and what he has dealt with. I would like to know, though, from a soldier's perspective, when you hear the type of language, the word specifically sacred, when you hear the honorable service and characterization of Bo Bergdahl's service, what is your response?
Well, I guess nausea and projectile vomiting come to mind right away. But when has this administration ever used sacred, for goodness sakes, in any of its talking points? And clearly, that was a White House talking point because everybody immediately picked it up and repeated it. I'm surprised Susan Rice passed up the opportunity. This whole thing, first off, she says, well, we'll have to see what happened after we get him back and everything. And then, but she immediately characterizes it as distinguished service and this kind of thing.
Distinction and honor, yes.
We've heard nothing to the contrary from any of his, the members of his unit or in any sort of position like the Special Operations Forces who were staged out to go after this guy, that he's been anything but a deserter. He put down his rifle. He took off his body armor and equipment. He left everything but a flashlight, a water bottle, a water bottle, a canteen, and a knife, and then walked into the local village and started asking, "Where's the Taliban?" So it doesn't strike me that this has been 5 years of captivity. This has been 5 years of collaboration. This is not new. I mean, it's, you know, I'm not sure how much the listeners are into their, you know, military history, say, since the Korean War, but we had quite a few of these kind of people in the Vietnam War. Bobby Garwood comes to mind. There were others. In fact, one of my unit's missions at the time was to try to find some of these guys who had gone over to the enemy. But that's a story for another day. We had several during the Korean War who, in effect, defected to the communist side. And over the years, in the Cold War period, we had a handful of soldiers and other military people who defected. So it's not like this is a phenomenon that's never raised its head before. And I think we just need to recognize it for what it is. The kid isn't a deserter. I mean, he isn't a hero. He's a deserter. And it needs to be settled in a military court under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, Article 85, desertion in time of war, and then let the court decide. Now, is that going to happen? I wouldn't be surprised if we didn't start talking about presidential pardons under the rubric that, oh, he's been with the Taliban for 5 years, therefore he's suffered enough, this kind of thing. Frankly, I'm aggravated at the whole thing, Crane, because I think it's a wag the dog initiative designed to distract from what was really hitting the administration hard and the president personally with this Veterans Administration debacle.
Let's stick with the theme then, because
Sure.
what we're talking about is the American soldier. And I've asked you about this before, Colonel, but I'd like you to expound upon it as much as you would like, sir, with respect. But we've talked about the fact that President Obama ignored his general's advice on the troop levels. We abandoned Iraq because we didn't change the name of our soldiers to diplomatic soldiers. They couldn't get that done. They totally tanked it and then said, oh, we couldn't do it. It had to go to the parliament. They didn't have to go to the parliament. You know more about that than I will ever. My point is, we've seen the American soldier talk about, we care about our soldiers. And the top story has been the VA scandal, because it's a scandal. The president, when senator sat on the committee, came in with the ideas. Stories were released in the transition team. He was aware of it. All of this, the treatment of the American soldier. Tell me, what's this doing to our military morale-wise?
Well, I think I think you got a good example of that when he went up to do his foreign policy speech at West Point. Even the media sycophants were reporting the fact that he got, an icy reception up there. I think that's actually a quote from one of them. It was very tepid. Most of the cadets sat on their hands. The speech itself was merely a bunch of old bromides recycled in typical Obama administration fashion. And the military is completely turned off with this guy. And if I'm half of a mind, Crane, that the administration was caught flat-footed on this Bergdahl thing. If you kind of walk the cat backwards and you say, okay, they're being hammered by both sides of the aisle, by the way, by many, many Democrats, and even by some of the centrist media on the VA scandals as being completely unacceptable and inexplicable, then suddenly, after Bergdahl has been held for 5 years, and then suddenly, without congressional notification required by law, 5 of the worst Taliban leadership is released suddenly from Gitmo without the congressional notification, without any word to the American public, certainly. And then we get the guy back, and this prisoner exchange has dominated headlines and conversations now, and the VA issue has been pushed off to the side. So The other thing I think, though, is that I believe that the administration misread the whole situation and seriously thought that, oh, if we get Bergdahl back, that's going to bring the American veterans and the military back at least to, an acceptable support status, if not an, enthusiastic support status, because we're going to show we really care about our soldiers, which is ridiculous. How long has that Marine been sitting in that jail in Mexico, for example? So I think that this was intended to knock the VA scandal off the front page, in which it succeeded, but I think it's backfiring on the administration because I think that they're so clueless, so absolutely ignorant about what the military is, what the values of the military are, that they actually thought that bringing Bergdahl back would somehow win them the support and affection from the military, and this is blowing up in their face.
Colonel, we have the Secretary of Defense, Chuck Hagel, signing off on this and defending the decision. Here he is doing just that. Let's roll it.
Well, first of all, we didn't negotiate with terrorists. As I said and explained it before, Sergeant Bergdahl is a prisoner of war. That's a normal process in getting your prisoners back. That's first. Second, as to your bigger question, we are dealing with terrorism and hostage taking all the time, everywhere. I think America's record is pretty clear on going after terrorists, especially those who take hostages. And I don't think what we did in getting our prisoner of war released in any way would somehow encourage terrorists to take our American servicemen prisoner or hostage.
Colonel, I haven't served a day in the military, as you well know. I look at and hear what he said, and I look at the substance of it, and I just can't believe it's coming out of a man who has served this country and comes up with those conclusions. I just don't know how it happens. And I asked a lot of questions about his opinions during the Iraq War. So this can happen. People can agree, disagree. When I disagree with somebody like our Secretary of Defense, I'll be called, if I'm talking about war and my belief that it is the right thing to do and the right policy, I'll be called a chicken hawk. You know the game. But you tell me, what's going on there? What do you make of his analysis, Secretary Hagel's analysis?
Well, tortured comes to mind immediately. I mean, he was, he was twisting himself into shapes that would make your average pretzel green with envy, Crane. The logic just didn't follow, particularly that last segment about, this isn't going to encourage terrorists to take more American prisoners. Why not? Success breeds success, and, Mr. Secretary, you're giving them a pretty large success here. What makes you think that suddenly they'd say, well, gee, it worked that time, but we won't bother to try it again? I mean, that seems like it flies in the face of logic as well as human nature. And then this business about, I don't know if you paid any attention, well, how much attention that the listeners paid to that, but if you noticed, it was prisoner of war, prisoner of war, prisoner of war, repeated ad infinitum, because the purpose of this whole media attack that the administration is doing is to try to convince all of us that Bergdahl really was a POW and not a defector, not a traitor. And what's worked for them in the past is that if they keep repeating it often enough, then pretty soon they feel like enough people believe it, and that the media will pick it up and carry the ball for them. I don't see Bergdahl as a POW. I see him as a defector. And why we should release terrorists that were among the worst of the worst, and as you know, and some of the listeners probably are aware of, Crane, I spent 3 years of my life researching and visiting Guantanamo and learning about these people. And these are not, your ordinary run-of-the-mill criminals, as bad as criminals might be. These guys are committed jihadists who live for one thing and one thing only, and that's the destruction of the West and the United States. So to think that this was any kind of a successful foreign policy negotiation with an outcome that's going to be anything less than disastrous is simply pie in the sky and drinking your own bathwater.
Colonel, your book, Inside Gitmo, you wrote that to defend those who were serving on Guantanamo Bay, in Guantanamo Bay and the facility as we know it, and still do. You wrote your original book, your first book, Pardon, to honor your father and those that served in the Forgotten War. And you wrote Military Police, Warrior Police, to honor those who are serving in that capacity in Iraq and Afghanistan. You have honored people by telling the truth about so much of our history. You call yourself an amateur historian. I would argue that you're far beyond that. You've reached a professional level, not only having the fact that you're learned, but also that you've lived it and you go and get the truth. Now, I'm not patronizing you, sir. I'm bringing this up because Gitmo has been assailed by this administration as a reason for terrorism. And we covered a little of this in the first hour, but I've got to ask you, Colonel, when you start making Gitmo the cause of the problem, and you start talking about prisoners of war being exchanged when we're dealing with jihadists that you've just detailed in an American Enterprise Institute, if you go to Discover the Networks on front page, that is a baseline. They quote Colonel Cucullu about what these guys are and why they are not prisoners of war are entitled to certain protections under the Geneva Conventions. They're not. And you detail why. So, Colonel, why are we talking in this language? You've just taught, you just mentioned it, but this is almost like revisionist history right before our eyes.
Oh, this administration excels at that. I mean, they'll lie with a straight face in front of the American public and expect us to buy it. And the sad thing is that how large a percentage of our public does exactly that. And I think it's because of we have a too great a number in our society of poorly informed citizens who haven't made an effort to educate themselves. They're just happy to go along to get along. No, these guys aren't. The Guantanamo detainees, without going into a lot of detail, don't meet the standards of the Geneva Convention. They're considered unlawful combatants. I mean, that's the bottom line, not prisoners of war. Even if you stretch Hagel's definition and make Bergdahl a POW, which, as we said earlier, I don't think he is. He was. You don't trade illegal combatants who are committed to your destruction, excuse me, for a POW under any circumstances. It is negotiating with terrorists, despite what the Defense Secretary tried to obfuscate with his convoluted language. It certainly is. We're not supposed to be doing that. We do it anyway. And yet, again, I bring the attention to the Marine sergeant confined in Mexico. Mexico is supposed to be a friend and an ally. You would think one phone call down there would get that guy released to American custody. But rather than make one phone call to release a detained American citizen or do anything about the American citizen female detained with her kids in Sudan, instead we trade 5 terrorists, the worst of the worst out of Gitmo, for a deserter. And to me, this also presages, and I'll go on record saying this in 2014. I think that this presages a move by the administration to try to use similar tactics, non-notification of Congress and others, to empty Gitmo and therefore close it, if you understand what I mean.
Yes.
If there's no detainees down there, then why keep it open?
Final question, about 40 seconds. Colonel, we've referenced Jimmy Carter's impact on the U.S. military and through the end of the Vietnam War and the politicians abandoning and losing the war that the soldiers won. Tell me, are we at a place where we've been in history? Is it worse? Is it better? And what does that
Well, it's worse.
portend?
Now we're trying to lose 2 wars. We've already lost Iraq, which we had won. Now we're on our way to throwing away Afghanistan. The only good thing I can say about this, and it's really a stretch, is that, in Vietnam we had 58,000 killed. We've got considerably less losses in this one. But that doesn't make every individual loss as poignant and as bitter to the family, particularly when they see a waste by the politicians. And I think that's reprehensible, whether it's 50,000 or 1.
Colonel Gordon Cucullu, he is the president of the Valhalla Project. I will post it a little later, plus some of his work in the past that we've highlighted right here in the interview. Colonel, thank you. Great to be with you. Talk to you soon.
You too, Crane. Thanks very much.
God bless. Live with honor in your life, compassion in your heart, and always keep the faith in Jesus Christ. God knows you. God loves you. He created you, and you're worth it. God bless our soldiers. AFR Talk.